Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Supernatural Psychology, Roads Less Traveled. Edited by Travis Langley and Lynn Zubernis. Foreword by Jonathan Mayberry. Read by Joe Hempel and Hilary Huber. Foreword. Born to Fire. Jonathan Mayberry, New York Times best-selling author. People often ask me why I write about monsters. The question still surprises me, and I think my answer surprises them. I tell them that I don't write about monsters. I write about people who fight monsters. And that, my friend, is a very big difference. The difference is rooted in who I am, and it's the reason I've always gravitated to a certain kind of storytelling, both as a writer and as a lifelong fan. You see, I was raised by monsters. Real ones. My father was one. He was an intensely violent man, a criminal and an abuser who turned his own home into one of the outer rings of hell. He abused his children and assaulted friends and relatives, mostly female, but not always. And he was a big, powerful man who knew how to hit and how to hurt. I had 4 sisters, but I was the youngest in the family, a little kid. When I was young, on those quiet nights when nothing bad was happening at home, or when it was happening to someone else behind a locked door, I tried to close it all out by escaping into a book, or by crawling inside the worlds that unfolded on TV. This was the early 60s in Philadelphia, and we had the reruns of The Twilight Zone, and new episodes of The Outer Limits and Dark Shadows. We had late-night movies of the old Universal Picture monster flicks, and the newer Hammer horror films. I had a secret stash of Marvel comics and some of the old EC magazines like Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt. That's where I learned about monsters, about the people they preyed on and the people who fought back. I watched films like The Thing from Another World, Invaders from Mars, The Haunting, The Last Man on Earth, Horror of Dracula, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Blob, and so many others. In 1968, when I was 10, my buddy and I snuck into the cavernous old Midway Theater to see the world premiere of Night of the Living Dead. The films I liked most, the ones I was determined to watch again as soon as they reran them, were the ones where someone, no matter how weak or ordinary, stood up against monsters of incredible power. If I had a cinematic hero, it was probably the smart, athletic, energetic version of Abraham Van Helsing, as portrayed by Peter Cushing. Okay, sure, he also played the evil Dr. Frankenstein in a series of flicks, but it was his Van Helsing who spoke to me. He was the one who, despite being dreadfully afraid, would nevertheless summon the courage, information, and resources necessary to force a showdown with Dracula. What mattered more was that he did not have to. He could have slipped away back to Vienna and not put himself at risk to protect people he didn't even know all that well. However, fighting monsters had become his calling, and he girded his loins, grabbed his hammer and stake, and went to war. I wanted to be Van Helsing, that version of Van Helsing. I took some steps toward that goal, too. I began studying martial arts on the sly. My best friend's dad enrolled me in a dojo, and I later found out, paid for my lessons. He knew who and what my father was, and though he was too afraid to openly confront the neighborhood monster, he resisted in his own quietly subversive way. I was a very good student, diligent, hungry to build my knowledge and my abilities, and, well, okay, since I was also reading comic books, I wanted to be able to fight like Daredevil. I wanted to be as smart and capable as T'Challa, the Black Panther. I wanted to be as steadfast as Captain America. Now, at the time, I was learning about other kinds of monsters. My grandmother, who lived near us, was a wonderfully spooky old lady. Imagine Luna Lovegood from the Harry Potter series as an old woman. That's her. Nanny, as we called her, believed in everything. She had been 40 when she gave birth to my mother, and my mother was 41 when she had me. So when I was born in 1958, Nanny was 81, which means she was born in 1877. She'd been raised in Alsace-Lorraine and was of Scottish descent. She grew up in a place and at a time where most people still believed in the supernatural. Over the course of her life, Nanny delved deep into what she called the larger world, and she shared that knowledge with me. She told me about vampires, ghosts, werewolves, demons, fairies, imps, trolls, and more, and she gave me the folkloric versions of these monsters, not the version so often presented in fiction and film. For example, in folklore, there are hundreds of different kinds of vampires, thousands of different kinds of shape-shifting monsters, countless demons, each with its own unique qualities, dozens of different kinds of ghosts, and so on. In her world, there were so many different kinds of monsters, and they were also there, lurking just beyond the reach of a campfire or flashlight beam. Nanny told me about the powers and abilities of these monsters, but she also told me about their weaknesses, and about the people who hunted them. Exorcists, vampire hunters, ghost breakers, warrior monks, wise women, and more. She even talked about cases where good monsters hunted bad ones. Those fascinated me. Among my favorites were the Stragoni Benefici, vampires who had been captured by medieval priests and who, under torture, because let's face it, some old-time church leaders really dug their version of enhanced interrogation, were brought back to faith, after which they would be like vampire assassins for the church. Wild. My other favorite was the race of heroic warrior werewolves called the Benedanti, who descended into hell via their dreams to fight evil monsters. As the child of a monster, I was always afraid that I would grow up to be like my father. So reading about monsters who fought evil really, really mattered to me. Nanny also collected what she called dark tales, or as they are more popularly known these days, urban legends. Those were even scarier to me because they were not set in distant lands, and they didn't involve people who had died long ago. Her dark tales were about people living in cities or small towns. People like me. Scary stuff. These worlds all collided for me when I was 14. By then, I was getting some adult mass and muscle. I'd had years of jiu-jitsu, and I simply could not abide a monster in my house. I threw down against my father, who was 6 inches taller and had 80 more pounds of solid muscle, as well as a lifetime of experience in back-alley fighting. When it was over, the entire downstairs of my home was wrecked, and my father was being rushed to the hospital. He survived, though it was touch and go for a while there. And thereafter he was a different man. No longer an abuser, no longer violent. He never touched my sisters again. Or me. He didn't dare hurt anyone after that. I'd survived my own hell, had defeated my monster, and was, in a way, the hero of my own coming-of-age story. I remember a day when I was sitting on the mats at the jiu-jitsu dojo with my instructor. We were talking, drinking bottles of water, sweating, aching from a hard class, and we were the last ones in the place. It was one of the rare times when I opened up about my childhood, including what had just happened. My sensei told me his story, and I learned that he grew up in a similar hell. He said, "Some people get lucky and they're born into TV sitcom families. Happy parents and all their problems are minor and can be solved by the end of a 30-minute episode. Maybe once in a blue moon they'll get a whack across the fanny, but that's it. Those people are lucky, but they're also a long way from anyone I know. They're not like us." "So," I said, "what does that make us? Freaks? Victims? Damaged goods?" He looked at me for a long time, and there were odd lights in his eyes. "No, we're different is all. Not worse, not better. Different." "Different how?" I persisted. And he said, "We weren't born wrong or bad or anything like that. But we aren't like the people who were born into happiness and light. It's more like we were born to fire." Born to fire. I truly understood what he meant, and it spoke to one of those great unanswerable questions we humans sometimes pause to consider. What if? What if my father had been a different person? What if I'd run away instead of staying in that hell? What if I hadn't finally stood up to my old man and used my martial arts skills to stop the cycle of abuse in our house? What if I hadn't watched all those movies and read all those books about people standing up to a seemingly unbeatable negative force? What if? What if? It can be a real killer of a mental exercise, too, because we can't ever really know if life would have been better had that one kind of threat or that one transformative cause not been there. In moments of self-deception and rationalization, we try to blame the circumstances of our lives on fate or destiny. In worse moments, we believe ourselves to be hounded by bad luck. It works out the same, though. We can never know what our lives would have been like had things played out a little differently. But here's the thing. Having the trajectory of one's life forever changed by a tragic incident isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sure, the event is bad, that's a given. But the effect doesn't necessarily have to be equally bad. Sometimes good things come out of bad. Over the years, that concept grew in meaning for me because it seemed to define a very specific part of our culture, just as it defines a certain type of character in the stories I read and later wrote. Being born to fire isn't a flaw. It's not a condition or a scar. A lot of the most successful novels, comics, and short stories I've written are part of my desire to explore this phenomenon. In Ghost Road Blues and its sequels, a bunch of very ordinary people are pitted against an army of vampires. They prevail because they, like most people, are stronger and more resourceful than they think. My Joe Ledger thriller series pits the hero and his special ops team against massive international conspiracies and terrorist organizations. My Sam Hunter short stories feature a Benandanti werewolf who has become a private investigator specializing in cases involving innocent women and children. I don't write about monsters, you see. I really do write about the people who fight them. Which brings me to Supernatural and why I love that damn show so much. Sam and Dean Winchester were also born to fire. The tragic and horrific death of their mother left burn scars on their souls. As they peel back the layers of the complex history of their family, they see firsthand that there was always a darkness around them, and they feel the burn of that dreadful fire. The Winchester brothers don't have to take up this fight, though. It is a calling that they answer, however reluctantly, because they can't stand the thought of the monsters winning. I get that. I get that. Sometimes they go on a deliberate hunt, and sometimes the hunt finds them. There is an argument to be made, at least from a larger world perspective, that once you peer into the darkness and see what's there, then it also sees you. It knows you, and sometimes it goes hunting for you. If you're ready, if you've trained and armed yourself with weapons and knowledge, then you are ready for that fight, maybe even hungry for it, even though you know that winning can break your heart. Sam and Dean have had their hearts broken. They've been brutalized, broken in places, robbed of peace and lost in the darkness, their optimism fractured. But they keep coming back. They keep getting back to their feet, each and every time. Why? Because they were born to fire. And man, oh man, do they love to make the monsters burn. Introduction. The Word and the Why. Mark R. Pellegrino. Lucifer on Supernatural. When I came onto Supernatural, in what was to be the final season, I had no idea that the show would more than double its intended lifespan and grow stronger and more potent with age. To me, it was just a job like any other. Sure, I would be playing the iconic role of Lucifer, a being immortalized by brighter luminaries than I since Faust first crossed the boards to seal his deal with Mephistopheles. But Warner Brothers and the CW had very little in common with Marlowe, Goethe, or Shakespeare, so I never anticipated having anything more than a minimal impact on the world at large. Fast forward, and what was to be a 4 or 5 off in the final season turned into a few episodes here and a few episodes there in a never-ending saga. And as the character of Lucifer evolved through several iterations and vessels, from apocalyptic Lucifer to impish Lucifer, from Lucifer as potential savior to potential terminator, one thing remained constant and even grew: the love of the fandom. After a time, not sure when exactly, an interesting phenomenon occurred. What was once show and audience, actors and fans, began a process of merging. It was a gradual but palpable evolution from many disparate individuals to a singular group identity. The metamorphosis first took the form of a tentative label, a verbal identifier that set the supernatural fandom apart from other sci-fi or horror fandoms. It was a word, perhaps first tentatively thrown into the social mix by a passionate fan, or blurted out into the ether by an actor at his Q&A. The word probably got a couple of laughs at first, but for enough people the word unlocked a deep truth, and what started out as a half jest became a serious reality. The word was family. How did such an evolution happen? Was it the rebel spirit of the show? A mythology that irreverently turns classical religious images on their heads, angels not as guardians of men but arrogant pricks, and the devil as the most honest guy in the room, can be very seductive, I imagine. Or was it the unique alchemy of the cast? Supernatural is in the habit of hiring some pretty kind people who seem to have an aptitude for bonding with fans. Well, not to pound the drum of same old, but many shows with interesting mythologies and really nice people playing their roles still have mere fans, not families. So, what's the deal? A family, if it is not by blood relation, implies a deeper connection than mere commonality of interests or attitudes. It implies a felt sense, an identification, of likeness, of similarity, of mutuality. In other words, your family not so much because of shared interests, but because of shared souls. Family is that something in you that resonates with and recognizes that something in another. I have a theory as to what the something is that sits in the seat of the unconscious and is recognizable below words. I call it the inner orphan. An orphan is literally a child abandoned, usually by the death or absence of its parents. But the inner orphan is the displaced and disowned child in us all. Emptiness, displacement, and alienation have been feelings shared by many for generations. These feelings, and the attempts to grapple with them, have been the source of existentialist narratives and postmodernist novels for ages. Philosophers and social commentators have tried to find alienation ground zero for years, and have entertained many possible loci. The complexities caused by civilization itself, the decline of religion and social tradition as our moral maps, the birth of technology. In short, everything beyond the noble savage has been blamed for dehumanizing us and forcing us further from our own authenticity. But whatever the cause, whether by social construct or imperfect parenting, the inner orphan is in all of us and, like all sentient beings, seeks its own. Is it any wonder that the orphan in me seeks and finds comfort and camaraderie with the orphan in you? Is it any wonder that we gravitate to a show about orphans? Shakespeare rightly felt that art holds a mirror up to nature. If that is so, and I believe it is, supernatural, as art, cannot escape that noble human tradition. That mirror, the mirror of art, has a magical power of catharsis and transformation. By seeing, we are informed and healed. By knowing what's possible, we are transformed. In the show, the mirror is held up to a family of literal orphans who face up to the whims of an indifferent and often hostile universe, and win. They win not by the possession of some superhuman quality, but by the very human and attainable virtues of love, loyalty, certitude, courage, thought, and independence. I can think of nothing more cathartic and more empowering for the inner orphan to see and experience than the success of virtue in an indifferent, at best, or hostile world. But if that was all there was, we would still only be fans of a good, heroic narrative that used our common vulnerability as a story point, right? As fans and actors, we would still only interact on the imaginary level of the story. But what makes us a family is the exchange that takes place outside the show. If the show is the experience of orphans triumphant as a healing narrative, then the reality is the experience of orphans embracing one another in shameless acceptance. It's the virtues acted out in the show transferred to the community of fandom, where life imitates art for the betterment of us all. This show, like everything in our finite universe, will one day end. But what can live on for many generations, besides the reruns, is the confidence that comes from recognizing our brokenness among our fellows, embracing it, and mending it with the virtues of love, courage, loyalty, certitude, and independence. Embrace your inner orphan. He is the hero who will set you free.
Part 1. Flesh and Blood. Chapter 1. The Espion Family, The Psychology of Fandom. Lynn S. Zubernis. Check it out. There's actually fans. Not many of them, but still. Dean Winchester. The source of basic anxiety is the feeling of being isolated and helpless in a potentially hostile world. Psychoanalyst Karen Horney. Fans experience the fictional characters and shows they love in powerful ways. We binge watch for hours at a time, share experiences online, engage in spirited discussion with other fans about why Sam Winchester becomes addicted to demon blood or why Dean Winchester loves pie, and travel to conventions. We collect memorabilia, write fan fiction or create fan art or fan videos, and restore classic 1967 Impalas. Or maybe we just watch the show and love it. Psychological explanations for why people become fans have ranged from pathological, loneliness, attachment problems, even delusions, to an emphasis on normal developmental and social processes, such as identify formation, the importance of play, and the need to belong. Supernatural has been a cult fan favorite from the start, weathering near cancellation season after season in its early years, and surviving thanks to its passionate fan base. Supernatural has won numerous People's Choice Awards, the cover of the very first TV Guide fan favorite magazine, and online polls about everything from sexiest bad boy character to most tearjerker episode. Why are some people so passionate about Supernatural, or any television show? Perspectives on fan passions, individual psychology. Is this a misery thing? Early research on individual psychological motivations for being a media fan leaned toward pathological explanations, emphasizing the most extreme kinds of fan behavior and largely ignoring the everyday fan. One of the first researchers to conduct psychological studies of fans coined the frightening term parasocial relationship to describe the fan's one-way knowledge of a celebrity, which is not reciprocated, and even warned of the possibility of erotomanic delusions if a fan went too far down this slippery slope of fanish enthusiasm. Fans were viewed as dysfunctional and obsessive, trying to shore up a missing sense of fulfillment and identity, and compensating for a lack of relationships by becoming overly absorbed with a celebrity. Fans were hypothesized to be materialistic, insecurely attached, lonely, prone to fantasy and dissociation, and having lower cognitive functioning and a low level of well-being. Supernatural has reflected this pathologizing view of fans, along with more positive models, in its tradition of incorporating its fans into multiple meta-episodes. Meta being a colloquialism for metafiction, fiction that somehow alludes to its own fictional nature. Series creator Eric Kripke wrote the first portrayal of fans into the show with fangirl character Becky Rosen. Kripke's version of Becky can be seen as effectively poking fun at his show's fans. The character in early seasons was portrayed as knowledgeable and even allowed to save the day. Unfortunately, Becky returns later with a more pathologizing portrayal as a lonely, insecure young woman whose unhealthy obsession with Sam Winchester reflects these absorption addiction models. While some studies have found lower levels of psychological well-being, though, these were in small samples of self-categorized celebrity worshippers, those obsessed with individual celebrities, not television show fans. Eventually, the researchers concluded that celebrity worship was not problematic if carried out in moderation. Critics have noted that it would be conceptually flawed to treat celebrity worshipper as synonymous with fan. A more positive view of fans emerges from psychologists studying sports fans, who took as a starting point a more neutral conceptualization of fans. This may be because sports fans continue to be less stigmatized than media fans, although the two types of fans have been found to be similar in motivation and behavior. Several studies found a positive rather than a negative relationship between identifying as a fan and overall well-being, with sports fans of local teams having higher self-esteem, more positive emotions, less neuroticism, loneliness and feelings of alienation, and lower levels of depression. Later portrayals of fans on Supernatural have been more positive as well, especially kick-ass tech whiz and self-professed geek Charlie Bradbury, and the playwright Marie, whose unique fan fiction interpretation of Supernatural is eventually explicitly embraced by the Winchesters themselves. Supernatural is also notable for the reciprocal relationship between fans and actors that has developed over the years, thanks to high levels of interaction on social media and an unprecedented number of conventions. The actors tend to have a more positive view of their fans thanks to this interaction. Stereotypes and stigma tend to fall away when people interact face-to-face, which is precisely what has happened with every other weekend conventions. In an early interview, series lead Jensen Ackles talked about how his view of Supernatural fans changed once he started meeting them. It was kind of surprising when the show really got its feet under it in the middle of the first season, and we started getting feedback and recognition of the show, and it was from unlikely characters. The WB was a network focused on a demographic that was obviously much younger. The people coming up and talking to us or writing about the show online happened to be an older audience, and a very intelligent audience. It wasn't, "What side of the bed do you sleep on?" and "Do you wear boxers or briefs?" They wanted to know why this character said this, and what do they mean by that, and could there be double meanings, and how this character relates to that or not. It was kind of refreshing. Series lead Jared Padalecki also wanted to let fans know that he wasn't so different from them, identifying as a fan himself. One of the funnier things that happened at a con was when that sweet girl got up to ask a question and started sobbing, and I wanted to say, "Oh my, it's okay, I'm a fan too." If I saw Eddie Vedder, for example, I'd be like, I don't even know what I'm going to say. In fact, it was series lead Jared Padalecki who first coined the term SPN family to describe the reciprocal relationship that has developed between actors and fans. Wanting to be just like you, a developmental view of individual identity. A similarly positive view of being a fan comes from a lifespan development perspective. In contrast to the view of fans as dysfunctional and obsessive, this research emphasizes the healthy aspects of being a fan. Psychosocial theory describes life as a series of stages, each driven by a crisis or challenge that needs to be negotiated. As we move through these stages, we develop our identity.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?